Welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. Join me, Pandora, and my guests as we explore history, cultural traditions, science, spirituality, social justice, and the healing aspects of the arts. Author-historian Dr. Michael Schoeppner is back with us talking about his book, Moral Contagion, Black Atlantic Sailors, Citizenship, and Diplomacy in Antebellum South. This is part 2 of our discussion. He's currently working on a book about the early history of American immigration law. He teaches classes on colonial America, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and American legal history at the University of Maine, Farmington. In part 1 of this interview, we learned that between 1822 and 1857, approximately 20,000 free black mariners from America and Britain were jailed for coming into southern ports under new laws. Up until that time, free black sailors moved freely through the Atlantic, north to south, east to west. It was during this time that the idea of a moral contagion became the basis of the new laws. Among many businessmen and slave owners, there were fears that abolitionist newspapers would sow the seeds of rebellion and plant the ideology of liberty among enslaved people. And at the time, there was a lot of talk about the Haitian Revolution, which started in 1791 and ended in 1804 with Haitian independence. So there was a lot of fear of slave rebellion, and that's how the new laws came into being. Some white whaling captains left crew members in jail. Others willingly paid the fines and the crew moved on. Ironically, imprisoned free African heritage folks from the North imprisoned in southern prisons and British sailors of African heritage wound up being imprisoned with enslaved people. And we can only speculate what effect that might have during a time when abolition was on everyone's mind. It wasn't long before the Civil War happened. You had mentioned that there wasn't the same kind of policing that we have today or anything like it. And so it really depended on individuals enforcing these laws. Can you talk about individuals enforcing these laws and what that looked like, who these people were, and then go into the whole legal resistance, lawyers defending these mariners?
Yeah, so the method of surveillance, again, there's not everybody's carrying around a GPS device that also sort of carries your opinions on things, right? That is accessible by authority, by the state. So the methods of surveillance were really broad. Places like Alabama and Mississippi in the 1830s, they're largely backwoods. There's not an urban Alabama, right? There's not an urban Mississippi. I mean, Biloxi hardly exists. Mobile is a town with a couple of crossroads in the 1830s and 1840s. And so the idea that there's sort of an urban police force to do something, it's just not true. And even in Charleston, there's not really a police force. We don't really see one anywhere except for perhaps New Orleans as we get into the 1850s. So the idea that you have a policing body, and again, it's kind of hard for the modern mind to think about that, but it's just not like the police force that we see now. And so states actually task sometimes, right? They task local officials to do the work. Sheriffs must board every vessel and make sure this is happening. And if they don't, they are liable for civil fines. So if the sheriff decides, well, you know what? I think this whole problem is overblown. I think that the fear that these lawmakers over in Columbia, if they're in Charleston, over in Columbia, that these lame brains are doing this for political reasons. It's not really a threat. I am more interested in taking care of the Charleston Chamber of Commerce, who wants this law not enforced. I'm just going to sit back and not do this. And Charleston will become, I won't call it a sanctuary city, right? But we're going to ignore jurisdictionally what a central authority is mandating. Then there wasn't a vehicle to rectify that. Columbia, South Carolina, the lawmakers there make it sort of civilly problematic now. Now, if a sheriff doesn't do what he's supposed to do, he can pay a fine. On top of that, citizens take it upon themselves to do this. In Charleston, the South Carolina Association forms with a specific purpose of making sure that the sheriff is following the laws against free black people and against enslaved people. And this is a very well-funded institution Revolutionary War heroes are a part of this, and I should put heroes in scare quotes, right? Wealthy planters who spend their summers in Charleston, they are part of the South Carolina Association, and they incorporate. They literally become an incorporation. They are recognized by the state, and they are basically a private police force. And they deputize themselves to go and make sure that every single vessel that comes in is being filtered for free Black sailors. So that's one method of doing it, right? You literally have a privatized police force that is chartered by the state. So is it a state entity or not? Nobody really knows. But pragmatically, it doesn't matter. The result is that these Black sailors are going to jail by the hundreds. Other states empower individuals to file reports with law enforcement about people who are violating this law. And they get a share of the proceeds of the jail fees that come in. In other words, it becomes financial. There's a financial incentive. If you turn in somebody, you get paid. And there are, I suppose, modern corollaries to that, whereby you can be rewarded for turning in somebody if they are an illegal migrant or something like that. So there are ways that the state can go about doing this, right? They pass laws that incentivize enforcement for individuals to go and do this. And so you can actually I don't know if you can quite make a living, but you can certainly supplement your income by going and sort of filing these reports. But eventually, and especially in urban areas, police forces are doing this work. And they're basically sweeping through Black areas of town. And that's what is, I think, most problematic about what we see in the antebellum period and the way that it correlates to what's going on now. And this is not just about free Black sailors. This is about free Black migrants generally. So all across the United States, this is not just a Southern phenomenon. States like Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Oregon, they pass laws that ban free Black people from moving there at all. So you cannot move here. If you come here, you have X amount of days, depending on the state, to leave. All the Southern states have these too, but this is also sort of going beyond the South. One of the states that puts this into place is Missouri. And St. Louis is a thriving town, right? It is both sort of this key point on the river system, but it's also the gateway to the West. So it is a bustling city by the time we get to 1850. And it creates a police force that routinely sweeps through Black areas of town looking for what they would call legal immigrants, people living illegally. And that's the title of my second book, Living Illegally. So free Black people that cross into Missouri from Illinois. And again, that is not far. That is literally crossing the 200 yards of the river, and you are now in Missouri. And so free Black people that move from Illinois, a free state, into Missouri, all of them are living there illegally. And if they get taken up by the dragnet, by the police, they get sent to court. There's no trial. There's no due process. This is not a criminal sort of thing. This is a bureaucratic administrative procedure. The recorder court finds them guilty of living illegally. They are fined $10. They're given 3 days to leave. If they don't, and they get pulled up in another dragnet, they get fined $10. They're given 3 days to leave. And so it creates this sort of system whereby the police and the courts, with no due process, nobody's once you are found guilty of illegal migration, living illegally, there's no sort of you can't go to the county court. There's no sort of avenue. You have been found guilty of illegal migration, and then you're fined and then you're sent underway. By the way, if you don't have $10, you're whipped 10 stripes, and that gives you sort of a grotesque correlation of what I don't know what a lash across the back is worth for people in Antebellum, Missouri. But this just gets to the point of surveillance and who actually suffers from surveillance. Yes, the idea is about filtering out these dangerous outsiders, right? And making sure that people who are living illegally are here. You have to come by legal means, right? And of course, there are no legal means. But the people that are suffering are not just migrants, right? Black St. Louis people, Black Missourians are being terrorized by this law. They're the ones whose houses are being broken into in the middle of the night and being asked, hey, are there runaway slaves here or are there illegal Black migrants here? And those two things are often fused together, runaway slaves, illegal migrants. And that connection of both living in a state of illegality is harrowing. And it certainly, I think, is something that we should be thinking about now. Because if you have no due process rights, if you have no legal personhood, you are basically equating illegal migrants to enslaved people. And that is true in the language and the actions of Antebellum, Missouri, but it's also true, I think, to what we're seeing now. the absence of legal personhood is the definition of slavery, right? And that's, I think, what we're seeing with illegal migrants. But it also means that American citizens, people who are living here legally, are the ones that are also feeling the brunt of this sort of surveillance. They're not safe, and they're paying the equivalent of a race tax. Because they look like they might be illegal, they have to spend the time, the energy, the resources to prove that they're not. And there are a host of cases in Antebellum St. Louis that are in the second book that describe this, what I call a well, I don't come up with this term, but I apply it in this setting, this idea of a black tax. You have to take time off work. You have to find white witnesses that'll come down and sort of make sure that the state knows that you are not living illegally just to show that you belong. But there are white immigrants from Germany and Ireland by the tens of thousands living in St. Louis, and none of them have to do that. And so that sort of is one of I think, the key contrasts here about what surveillance is meant to do. It's not about illegal migration as much as it is about racial terrorization.
How do these slave owners get Black folks back into a position of submission?
Yeah. And again, like, economic growth is predicated on a thriving population, right? It is really tough to maintain economic growth when your population is decreasing. Mm-hmm. Ask Japan now, ask Italy. They're begging for migrants to come over, right? And, Western states know this, that if they don't entice people to come over, then the growth that they're anticipating, the speculative investments that they're making will never come to fruition. And that's have to be balanced against racialized discourse and the fears of slaveholders and Southern whites that free Black people pose a threat to their social order. And, this plays out there's different permutations, obviously, in Oregon and in places like California where they debate Black exclusion. It plays out in different places and in different times. But it seems like every state is dealing with it. They're literally questioning whether it makes sense to prevent Black migration, whether that will be a net positive or a net benefit for the state, for growth, for democracy, et cetera.
And we're at a time when our economy is dependent on migrant workers picking the fields and taking wages that most white Americans aren't willing to. So when you talk about shooting yourself in the foot with these laws.
And there's another similarity too, like some of the language of northern jurisdictions that don't allow free Black migrants, and this includes river workers, right? I mean, Illinois, Indiana, right? Those are states that are on a major water thoroughfare. So these are not, this isn't the merchant marine, this is the river workforce, but it's the same sort of issue. But moral contagion is expansive enough to not just incorporate anti-slavery sentiment and ideas. Moral contagion is also being used to describe free Black people as lazy, indolent, morally backwards, dishonest. And that becomes the same rationale to prevent their migration. So Illinois, when they pass a ban on Black migration, they're saying Black people are dangerous to the social order. One of the things they say also is that Black workers drive down wages because they work for less money than white workers. And so if they come in, they're going to drive down wages. But again, there's no consistency whatsoever in that. You cannot simultaneously be lazy and indolent and also work for less wages and getting people to hire you. You can't be both of those things at the same time. And we see the same sort of rhetoric now about illegal migrants. They drive down workers. They're taking jobs away from white people, but they're also lazy. They're also mooching off the system. So this is about physical conservatism. We hear the adage all the time. This is about physical conservatism. We can't take care of the world's population. We need to take care of our own. So many times I see in online social media, Facebook posts, hey, let's take care of our veterans first, and then we can think about taking care of the poor of other countries. And it's like that discourse runs completely contrary to the other part of the discourse that says that they're lowering wages because they're doing the work that nobody else wants to do. Like, you can't do both of those. You can't be both of those things simultaneously. And it exposes the fallacy of those ideological constructs. It's garbage. It is intellectually dishonest to claim both of those things at the same time. And it was the same for free Black migrants as well. This was not about fiscal conservatism. This was not about maintaining any sort of wage structure. This is about racism. But that is what is going on here. And you can convince perhaps some people to join to join your political movement by pretending it's something else. But at heart, that's what it's about.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Healing Wisdom. I'm Pandora Peoples, and we're speaking with author-historian Dr. Michael Schoeppner. He teaches at the University of Maine, Farmington, and he's the author of Moral Contagion, Black Atlantic Sailors, Citizenship and Diplomacy, and Antebellum South. He's working on a new book about early history of American immigration law. He teaches classes on American legal history, the Civil War, the American Revolution, and colonial America. Thank you so much for the work that you do. I'm looking forward to reading your new book. And when is that set to come out?
Oh, no. I'm about to go on fellowship soon to basically write it. So I've done most of the research. I've spent some time doing the work in actually Massachusetts. I was at the American Antiquarian Society on a fellowship for a little while and got great work on some of the things that are going on in St. Louis. But the book's not going to be out for a while. I still have a bunch of writing to do. But it's nice to do. That's one of the reasons, too. I mean, this does good work for, I think, getting the message out about what's going on with contemporary immigration issues. But it also, just by forcing me to talk about it out loud with people who are interested and curious about the work, it allows me to sort of structure things in my head. So you're accelerating the writing process by having me on.
I actually have one last question. You get into it a lot in your book, but in this conversation you haven't, is, they were breaking treaties. Could you speak to that, and also all of the ways in which these laws were challenged? Yeah.
So the legal issue, right? And this is especially important because of in the contemporary context, this is important because of the ways that the 14th Amendment is being challenged, and people are arguing about the limits to birthright citizenship. Right. So these laws were being contested all over the South and all over the North as well. So attorneys were taking on cases for Black clients and for ship owners that are arguing that these laws were unconstitutional. One of the arguments that was often posited was that these laws that banned Black sailors, were obvious infringements on the Constitution's Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause endows in Congress and in the federal government the power to regulate interstate and international trade. And so the attorneys would argue that these laws by the states were interrupting interstate and international commerce, and the states can't do that. Only Congress can do that. There were lots of different responses to that. Some were saying that the states can regulate commerce too, not just the federal government, so this idea of concurrency. But most often, they relied on something called the police power, this idea that laws that target people who are dangerous may interrupt commerce, but it is not in its nature a commercial regulation, like quarantine, right? So that's one way to defend those laws. Another way to contest the laws was to say something like people representing Black British sailors and Black British merchants. There are treaties on the books between the United States and Great Britain. For instance, the Commercial Convention of 1815, which quite explicitly allows for British subjects to have access to the port cities of the United States while they're conducting commercial transactions. And that applies to the captain, that applies to the crew, that applies to everybody that's working on board of these commercial vessels. And this is not something like out of the ordinary for international commercial treaties to contain, right? This is standard. This is like what we would now call boilerplate language, right? And so there are these treaties in place between the United States and Great Britain that guarantee guarantee British subjects the right to ingress the United States. And so attorneys that are working with the British government and with these Black sailors say, well, these are Black British subjects. They are protected by the treaty. They have the right to enter. And sometimes people who are defending laws would say something like, well, just because we have a treaty with you does not mean that somebody infected with the plague has access to our shores, right? So because they're sick, I don't know, philosophically sick, they can be excluded, and it's not a violation of a treaty. And that was sort of standard fare. But in 1832, the Attorney General, Roger Taney, who would later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he offered an advisory opinion to President Andrew Jackson, and he took this one step further. So he was hearing complaints from attorneys. He was hearing complaints from the British legation, from the British, what we now call the British ambassador, about what's going on in southern port cities. And so he offers an advisory opinion. And that advisory opinion says that Black British people are not, quote, subjects of the crown because they are not full rights-bearing subjects. And on top of that, because in 1815, white Americans did not think that Black people were part of the body politic, they could not be considered part of the people protected in subsequent years. In other words, the treaty did not apply to Black people because nobody in 1815, when the treaty was signed, thought that Black people were really citizens or subjects. That is the exact argument he makes in Dred Scott 25 years later, basically saying that Black people are not and can never be citizens of the United States. And so one of the ways to look at these laws and say, okay, we're defending these from constitutional attacks is by simply claiming that Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. And that puts the British government in a position where diplomacy is not working. Some British governments, usually the Tories and the Conservatives, they tried to placate Southern lawmakers and convince them to liberalize their laws. The Whigs tend to be a little bit more confrontational and demand an end or else. But in all cases, it's all bark. There's no bite. There's never an actual sort of like, there's no treaty that works this out. There's no threat to commercial cessation. There's no boycotting. It's all just talking. One of the things that I will be arguing in the next book, and that I talk about somewhat in Moral Contagion, is that Black people combat this denial of their rights by saying, wait a second, we are rights-bearing individuals. We were born here. We have been here since the beginning. We've been here longer than many of you. And I talk about this in the book. One of the Black people that gets arrested in Missouri for being an illegal migrant is half Native American. And his family goes back to, the Senecas. Like at the time of Dutch colonization, the Senecas were there. And this guy's saying, you're telling me I can't move to Missouri, right? But they claim this idea of birthright citizenship, that because they're born here, they are a citizen, and they are a citizen of the state in which they reside. And because of that, the state governments can't deprive them of certain rights. And that was the understanding that went into the making of the 14th Amendment, that you have a right of free travel throughout the country if you're a citizen of this country. And when you go overseas, you are going to be treated as a citizen in the treaties of the United States. And so the antebellum notion of citizenship that was destroyed by the 14th Amendment is now seemingly trying to be brought back to life by the Trump administration, that the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment isn't what it is quite obviously meant to do, and that is endow people with citizenship rights if they're born here. So, yeah, I think that's sort of another one of the similarities and one of the legal issues, and one of the reasons that the Trump administration is so intent on backtracking on birthright citizenship and thinking about migration and a lack of due process as being something that is okay. This is harkening back to the antebellum period because the 14th Amendment was meant to prevent things like this from happening. And so the 14th Amendment as is does not allow it. So the 14th Amendment must be changed. So that I think that's the sort of analog between the antebellum discourse of citizenship and what we see in contemporary political context.
Thank you so much, author Professor Michael Schoeppner, for being with us today. Folks can find your book, Moral Contagion, at their local bookstores.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful.
You've been listening to Healing Wisdom. You can find this episode and others like it on WOMR.org, healingwisdomradioshow.com, and wherever you get your podcasts.